at the last minute. But anyway, welcome to those of you who are here. I'm Jenny Shanker from the Michigan Community College Association, and we're here to talk about guided self-placement in Michigan. This is our workshop for implementing for colleges who are looking at implementing guided self-placement. I'm joined by Lori Flad from Achieving the Dream, who will be facilitating most of the workshop. And as I mentioned earlier, if everyone could please add their institution to their name on the screen so that we can see where you're from when we're talking. We will be doing some interacting in this meeting. So looking forward to spending some time with you talking about guided self-placement. And I'm going to go ahead and get started kick us off with some context for guided self-placement in Michigan. And I see I have the wrong date on this slide. How'd that happen? Okay, let's move on from that one quickly. These are our partners in this work of Achieving the Dream, who, as I mentioned, Laurie is here to help facilitate this workshop. We've also worked with folks from Strong Start to Finish. We are working closely with the Department of 60 by 30 at the Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Growth. Opportunity, no, O is opportunity. And our funding comes for this activity, and this series of workshops comes from the Kresge Foundation. The part of the impetus for this workshop and this series of activities is the Michigan Developmental Education and Placement Recommendations, which did come from the Office of 60 by 30 last June of 2021. Those were released. And those that was created by a working group that was put together by Leo in response to the legislative mandate in the Michigan Reconnect that not only that colleges change their practices with regard to delivering developmental education and support for Gateway Math and English, but also that Leo would put together a working group to discuss placement practices. And so just as a quick refresher, you see those, the gist of those placement education and placement recommendations from Leo here on the screen. So discontinuing the practice of universal testing for mandatory placement, discontinuing the use of prerequisite developmental courses and sequences, using a high school GPA of 2.5 or better, including a self-reported GPA, to place directly into Gateway Math and English, provide co-requisite support designed to help students complete the Gateway courses in a single semester. So stopping the practice of having students complete multiple semesters before they're even able to access the Gateway course. And then the potential to offer additional support through a model that's offered at no cost. And then finally, to use a robust system of guided self-placement to determine who needs what levels of support in these in the Gateway classes. So those are the kind of the core of the recommendations and the reason that we are here. The Reconnect placement language specifically here asks that the working group be formed to identify placement practices and policies and to emphasize placement in college level courses for as many students as possible, and to encourage eligible institutions across the state to adopt consistent placement policies and clearly communicate the policies for course placement and options for remedial instruction to students. So that's what the working group was charged to do. One of the results was those recommendations on the previous slide. This is what the placement recommendations in the MDEPR look like, kind of in a flowchart form. So the placement recommendations are kind of keyed off of the high school GPA. If the student has a high school GPA less than 10 years old, then and it's greater than or equal to 2.5, they can be placed directly into a gateway course without co-requisite support. Or they can have the option to use the guided self-placement to see if they might, if the student feels insecure about going directly into the course with no support. Guided self-placement can help uncover that trepidation and allow the advisor to work with the student to decide whether or not the student wants to elect additional support. And then again, if the student has been out of high school for 10 years or more, the idea is to use the guided to not necessarily depend on that high school GPA, but to use the guided self-placement process to recommend whether or not the student should receive co-requisite support in their gateway class. So in order to clarify what we mean by guided self-placement and to surface a set of good practices and principles around guided self-placement, we convened a statewide work group to provide guidelines to help we meaning the Michigan Center for Student Success at the Michigan Community College Association, convened a statewide work group with practitioners from K-12 colleges, including faculty, advisors, and administrators, to put together this guided self-placement principles document. And one of the things that I want to emphasize as we kind of kick off this conversation about guided self-placement is that our intention with the work group for guided self-placement was that the use of these principles would be intentionally limited to the context of the Michigan Developmental Education and Placement recommendations and did not address the broader content of the legislation. So like the additional options in the Reconnect Act to offer developmental education in a compressed format or a modularized format are not really within the scope of the guided self-placement principles that we created. And in fact, particularly these principles were not intended to be used in the context where if you are still using multiple levels of developmental education and considering using guided self-placement to place students into those levels or within those levels, that's not recommended. That's not a recommended use of these principles. Anybody have any questions about the guided self-placement principles or the Reconnect legislation that we can address quickly? Okay, I'm not seeing or hearing anything. Please feel free to place questions in the chat. If you haven't looked at the Michigan Guided Self-Placement Principles, these are them here on the screen. So the idea is to for institutions to develop an asset-based process to help students make informed choices. A key to guided self-placement is that the student makes the final selection of their initial program applicable course. So it's not really guided self-placement if you ask the student a bunch of questions and then you tell them what they have to do. The students the key to guided self-placement is students are empowered to make the selection of whether or not they take the course with co-requisite support. It's important that faculty and staff collaborate in the design, implementation, and refinement of the supports of the GS of supports and also the guided self-placement policies and practices. We want to make information easy to find about the gateway course options, placement, provision of support. And that when you do put this process into place, you also put processes and guardrails into place to make sure that you are evaluating the process and policies on a regular basis. I had the opportunity to spend quite a lot of time in the spring of 2022 talking to all of our 28 public community colleges in Michigan to see to what extent they were they had implemented changes to their developmental education aligned with the Michigan Developmental Education and Placement recommendations and the Reconnect Act. So you'll see the website where you can find this report on the screen here. And I found the findings here, the colleges used a variety of models in terms of providing their support for gateway classes. So they may be using a dedicated support course, or also kind of known as an ALP style course. Some colleges chose instead to use embed support within special sections of gateway courses for students that needed extra help. So you'd find, an English Composition 1 class, for example, that would be usually 3 credits, might be 4 or 5 credits in the embedded support model, with the extra time being used to provide additional support. The other models which are sanctioned in the Reconnect Act, the current version of the Reconnect Act, are compressed model, 8 weeks and 8 weeks. Students who successfully complete a developmental course in the first half of the semester can progress to the gateway course in the second half of the semester. And then finally, the traditional kind of standalone or prerequisite courses that we're probably all familiar with, and some colleges are still using to a greater or lesser extent as they are in the process of transitioning to a more accelerated model. Pausing to check the chat. Well, thank you, Lori. I appreciate that. Okay, so I'll show you what the findings were in the scale of adoption results. And that is, you can see that we have a really robust adoption of co-requisite delivery for English. So we have 19 colleges who are using the ALP style, the side-by-side course, where students are enrolled in a regular section of the gateway course and then an additional support section. 19 colleges are actually fully scaled with that. And then, or almost all, like I think 17 or 18 are fully scaled and the others are on their way. The embedded support, again, another 5. So that brings us then to 24 of our 28 colleges who are using a co-requisite delivery for English. And then another 3 colleges who are piloting a co-requisite model at this, when I was speaking with them last spring. Math is a little bit more spotty in terms of adoption. These colleges who have the dedicated support course and the embedded support course, most of them are still piloting or beginning to scale. A couple of them have gone to scale with quantitative reasoning. Statistics, again, a fewer numbers in terms of using the co-requisite models, but still a pretty robust adoption. But you start to see that, a number of colleges are still using prereq dev ed for statistics. And then for the preparation for calculus or the pathway to calculus, overwhelmingly colleges are still using prereq dev ed. In some cases, they're compressing those dev ed courses, so they're collapsing levels into each other, but those are still a class that they need to complete before they qualify for the gateway course. A few colleges, well, about half the colleges are looking at some kind of co-requisite model for the pathway to calculus, but this one seems to be kind of the most challenging for colleges to make the transition. So I point those out to you, again, remembering what I said about the guided self-placement. It's going to be much harder to use guided self-placement if you are still using multiple levels of prereq developmental ed. It's going to just introduce a lot more complexity into the process for the students and for you all as advisors. Finally, this is what the placement practices looked like when I talked to the colleges in the spring. So you can see the different models. ranging from primarily test reliant or primarily GPA reliant through multiple measures using both test or GPA, kind of using, many colleges are using like a super scoring approach, where if you have a not so great SAT score, but you have or a GPA of 2.5 or higher, that they would prefer the GPA and use that to place the student. Or if students don't have a GPA or SAT score, but they take an ALEX test, for example, with math, they might use that test to place them, higher in their sequence. So that's like most colleges are described some sort of multiple measures approach. And then you see 9 colleges who are experimenting with guided self-placement. And very few had systematically implemented guided self-placement at scale. The ones who have are focused in English, and we're going to hear from at least one of those colleges a little bit later in this presentation. Going to pause again. Please put questions in the chat while I do a couple of activities kind of meant to get to know a little bit more about who's in the room. So let's see. I'm going to launch a poll. Can people see the poll? Give me a nod.
I can see it, Jenny.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, and I see people are answering it. So yes, let's see who, what kind of experience is in the room. All right, the responses have slowed down and 87% of you have participated. Now 90%. Anybody still want to do the poll? Couple more minutes or a few more seconds. Okay, people are really surprisingly evenly divided in the room. The people who say that they have an active guided self-placement process have a little bit more are edging out the other options, but we have about a quarter of people who say they came here to learn about GSP, so welcome. And some that are familiar, some are part of a team that is developing a process now. So we have quite the mix of experience. So this is great. I'm glad to have this information. Okay, and then finally, I wanted to give you a chance to share in the chat to please just describe what your goal is for this academic year with guided self-placement. So it may be just to learn more about it. It may be to scale up something that you've been working on. Looking for just, to kind of capture what your plans are for this academic year with guided self-placement. And if anybody wants to unmute themselves and share your plans verbally, you can do that too. Great, interesting. It's a good mix of goals. Yeah, connection between faculty and advisors, Jolene, really important.
Yeah, so important.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you, Lori, to get started.
Okay.
People can feel free to continue to engage in the chat, but thank you for allowing me this time to provide some context, and I look forward to the rest of the workshop.
Excellent. Thanks, Jenny. I'm going to, I pushed the wrong button. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you all, how does that look? Does that look like it should?
Mm-hmm.
No notes, just slide. Is that correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you, Jenny. Well, thank you for having me. For those of you who I have not met yet, my name is Lori Flad. I'm the Director of Holistic Student Supports at Achieving the Dream, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk with you a little bit about guided self-placement. I will tell you that I've been at ATD about 4 years now, just over 4 years, but before that I spent my entire career in community college, which was a lot of years, as an instructor in science and math. So microbiology, anatomy and physiology, chemistry. And so I am very well-versed in prerequisites and developmental models. As a matter of fact, the institution that I worked at, I will tell you that I am not an expert in directed self-placement. While I know a lot about advising and holistic advising and how that looks on campuses, as far as directed self-placement, it is, or guided self-placement, it is not something that our college was doing. When I left the college, we were just moving to a multiple measures model. So that was about 4 years ago. And I know that they have iterated on that design over time, which, aligns nicely with that last principle on collecting data and iterating on your model. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about what I know that's going on nationally around guided self-placement. But I'm also really interested in hearing about the things that are going on at your institutions. So please feel free to drop something in the chat. If you would like to unmute, there's not that many of us. So, I think with, 40 of us roughly, if you would like to unmute your mic and jump in, I would love to have that. Because I'd love this to be a conversation. I feel like we have some really good expertise in the room. So this actually came out of a paper, a recent paper, and talking about, they called it directed self-placement. And I think that this is important because I share this quote because I think it's important to recognize that there isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all model to this guided self-placement. And as I look at your comments in the chat, I see that many of you are working on this model to make it your own at your own institutions, and how it's going to work with your students and how it's going to work with your courses and your curriculum on your campuses. So, I thank you for considering and being mindful of your own context and your own students. I think that's important. So, guided self-placement is not a product, right? It's not like a compass or an acuplacer that we purchase and it spits out, magical placement for students, but it's a set of principles and it's grounded in student choice. And I think that's, for those of you that are getting started, I think that's a really important piece of this work, is that it's grounded in student choice. Typical placement does not really even take student choice or student context into account, right? It's a singular lens of how the student is, deemed ready or not. And then the student has unless they choose to, protest, there's really no way for the student to be involved in the decision about placement. So it can be implemented in a variety of ways in varying contexts. So a lot of times when folks ask about, what works, many times the answer is it depends, right? Because it will depend on your context. So, this comes from a June study, and I like this graph because I think it clearly shows how choice and guidance, so student choice and institutional guidance, have interacted with different past methods of placement, and how guided self-placement really tries to maximize both institutional guidance and student choice. Placement is very often, I often try to think of this from the student perspective, right? And so placement is very often a student's, one of their first touches with us at our institutions, right? They show up on campus, maybe they filled out their application, and at least in my institution, they would go to the testing center, they'd sit down in front of a computer and they would take a placement test, and then they would be, placed into into math or English, or math and English. And it wasn't necessarily a very student-friendly process. It wasn't empowering. It didn't really take into account the student experience before they came to us. So grounding this process in the student experience and including student choice is important. And so, this just sort of lays out how traditional placement falls, pretty firmly in that bottom left quadrant, where there's very little institutional guidance and there's very little institutional choice or student choice, right? It usually is the result of some sort of placement test. The student gets their score and boom, they're placed into their course. And then, we have self-placement where there's not much institutional guidance, not necessarily the best option for students, because these are complicated decisions that students are making, perhaps with content that they don't have a lot of experience with, right? So having no institutional guidance may not be helpful. And then having no student choice also is not helpful because we need their context, right? So that informed or directed self-placement or guided self-placement, falls in that upper right quadrant. And that is where we are really trying to maximize both the institutional guidance and the student choice. And so as we think about, hold on, let me just check the chat really quickly. Okay, so Steve is sharing some of the work that's going on at Mid-Michigan. Thank you for that. Keep that coming. And we're going to actually talk to them in just a minute. I'm really excited about that. So, as we think about why guided self-placement, I think it's important that we consider this model as one that may be able to, if it's implemented properly, to give students more agency in the process and create a more equitable process of placement. Developmental education is expensive for students and it's expensive for their families. And there's no clear evidence in the data that it really helps them complete in a timely fashion. So it really does end up being sort of a death spiral where students don't work their way out. And we saw that as well at our institution. We knew it wasn't working well, but we continued to sort of propagate these inequities until we decided to switch over to multiple measures. So I also think that it's important that we consider guided self-placement because students hold key information about their ability to be successful that we don't necessarily glean from a placement test, right? We don't know their highest level of math necessarily that they've completed, or now multiple measures can help to get at this. We don't understand their level of confidence. Have they taken this before and struggled? Have they taken this before and done well? Do they struggle with certain types of exams, but they really understand this material? That's really hard to glean from a placement test. So this can end up being a process that is more socially just for them. Placement is, when we think about sort of how we came to be with the processes that we have in placement, these are processes that are really institution-centered with rules that we made up about what qualifies as ready, right? So I think it's not unheard of to start changing these rules a little bit and including additional input from students. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning is that, and I completely understand why we have in many instances taken this approach, is this efficiency mindset, right? We have a lot of students coming in our door and we have to have a way to consistently place them. So we try to be efficient with that process. And that's where a lot of these placement tests have, they're attractive, right? Because it's an easy way for us to test, assess lots of students and get them, placed in math or English. But what we're finding is that it has led to underplacement for students. and it isn't necessarily doing the things that we hoped, especially for success and completion, that we hoped it would do. And it's interesting. So I'm going to tell a little story on myself and show you. And if there's math faculty in the audience, please don't judge me. But I will say, so I work with a college and they have their guided self-placement assessment online. And so the other day, like just a couple of days ago, I said, oh, let me pretend I'm a student and go through this. Like, let's say I'm a returning student. I've been out of school for a while. So let's go ahead and jump in. I've been through 3 levels of calculus. And so let me see how I do, right? So I will tell you, and like I said, let's not judge. So this was one of the sample assessment questions. And so there was no prep involved for how I just jumped right in, like many of our students do, right, when they come onto campus with placement testing. And so I looked at this and I was like, oh, I could remember the equation of a line, but I couldn't remember how to generate the slope. And so I knew that if I could go back and take a look at, some resources, that probably within a day, I would be capable of answering this question correctly. But at that moment, right, with that singular assessment, I would not have been able to answer it correctly, and it would have definitely impacted my placement. So I think that, that is an important, as we think about the assessments that we give students. The assessments are important. It's really important for students to see the kinds of content that they'll be responsible for, but it's also really important to have a conversation with them, right, in some way about, because if somebody asked me, do I feel confident that I could answer this question? It would be yes, absolutely. I would just need to go back and look at my resources. It probably had been a little while since I covered this content, but yes, I could absolutely figure this out. So I would have some confidence around this, and I wouldn't feel that this would need to put me in an extra semester of math prep so I could, successfully complete this content. But those conversations, as we think about directed or guided self-placement, are really important. And as we think about our responsibility as advisors, how do we help with that process? Advising is such an important piece of getting students on the right path in so many ways at our institution, building relationships for the students on campus, and then helping them feel like they really belong on our campus. So as we think about what the advising role is, I go back to some of the principles that Jenny shared earlier. And I pulled these back because these are the principles that hopefully will help guide your creation of what you call a robust guided self-placement model at your institution. And as you look at these, there's a number of ways that you can implement and operationalize these principles on your campus. They're great guidelines, right, for making sure that you have good practices in whatever processes you stand up on your campuses. Some of the things I did want to point out, some of the things as I look at this from a holistic standpoint, from a holistic support standpoint, the things that I see here that are very promising from a holistic standpoint is that, first of all, it's extremely collaborative. Whereas traditional placement is not really collaborative, these guided self-placement principles are very collaborative in nature. So you can see in the middle in that green bar, faculty and staff collaborate in design, implementation, and refinement. You can also see that as you look at the yellow bar, at the yellow principle there, students make the final selection. And I think that that happens with support, right? So that includes the student voice, makes them a collaborator in the outcomes of their placement process. The other thing that I think as I look at this is the importance of communication, right? So communication, both how you communicate to each other and then how you communicate to students by making sure that you have strong, clear definitions, language that is easy to accept, to access, to understand, and to communicate. I think that's really important because, as I said earlier, some of these, we tend to be a little jargony in higher ed, right? So to make sure that we create language around these decisions that's easy to understand. It helps us to communicate with each other. And it also helps us to communicate to our students. Does somebody have anything they'd like to jump in and add? No? Excellent. And I think the last thing I will add about these principles that I think is really promising from we think of a holistic standpoint is that they're iterative, right? So that final principle there, that your processes are evaluated, reviewed, and revised. You know, these are, there's a lot of moving parts as you go to implement guided self-placement. And it's very likely that you may not get it completely right the first time, right? I saw somebody in the chat saying they were checking to see how 2.5 GPA worked with their students. That's, you know, that's what we're talking about here. That may work with your students. You may need to adjust that. I know that institution that I came from, you know, there are multiple measures. The first round of sort of deploying that with students, the results didn't look the way they wanted them to. It wasn't helping students as much as they thought it should. So they went back in and took a look at some of the ways that they were, some of the factors that they were using as they placed students. And they used that information to tweak a few things and see if they could make it better. So this, I think this is not going to be one and done either. And I love that you have iteration and review and assessment built into the principles. It's very holistic in nature. Does anybody have any questions so far? There's a lot of talking so far. I just want to I'll take a breath and see if you guys have anything that you'd like to share, or Jenny, if there's anything that you wanted to jump in and add.
Seems like people are just taking it in.
Okay, good.
Please put questions in the chat. I'll be watching and interrupt Laurie if we have anything. So don't hesitate to speak up if anything seems unclear or you have anything to comment on.
Super. Thanks, Jenny. So I wanted to just pull a couple things that, you know, as I was getting ready for our session today, I was looking to some of the other states that have made some moves already into guided self-placement. And so I started with California. I think that is a reasonable place to start because their work has been going on since about 2017, right? So in 2017, California passed Assembly Bill 705, and that limited the way that students could be placed in developmental education in the state of California. And then just last week, the legislature passed Assembly Bill 1705, which builds on that 2017 legislation and further restricts the conditions that allow colleges to place students in developmental education. So I think that initial approach with AB 705, they weren't getting the permeation of these types of processes through the California community colleges that they hoped they would. So what they are trying to do is make sure that as many students as possible get placed into college level, college credit bearing math and English courses. And so, you know, as you take a look at the recommendations out of the state of California, you know, they recommend that a guided self-placement model at a minimum should include, and I love the way that they phrase their recommendations, that it includes the opportunity for students to do the following things. So it really does center the student, right? And I think you'll see that many of these recommendations align really nicely with the work that's going on in Michigan as well. But as I looked a little deeper, you know, I feel like these recommendations can help unpack how to implement, or some ways to possibly implement principles 1 and 2 of Michigan's principles. And especially as we look at the last 3 bullets on here, right? Advisor guidance is critical as students unpack these complex choices. So consulting with a counselor or a disciplined faculty regarding their evaluation that they took, right? Their self-evaluation, their program requirements, and their course options. Those are 3 probably very complicated things for students as they arrive on our campus. If students don't have somebody who can, or perhaps let's say they're first generation students, right? And they may not have somebody at home that can sort of walk them through this process. This can be a lot. So I think the, expertise of advisors or faculty, or if faculty are advisors, to make sure that students really understand what their options are is so critical as students think about their placement. It's helpful for students to familiarize themselves with the support options they have available, right? So as in Michigan, do students need co-requisite support or do they not? Or is it recommended for them? And then helping students decide which course is most suitable for them to reach their goal. And I think helping them see how that math or English course connects with their pathway, with their curriculum pathway, and gets them closer to the finish line is important as they make those choices. Steve, I agree with you. So I just popped into the chat to look to see. So advising is critical, but if your student to advisor ratio is high, well, your advisors have the time to engage with your students. I agree, right? And so I think as colleges think about how they prepare for this type of model, whoever is responsible for the conversations with the student, and sometimes it's an advisor, it's not always an advisor, right? They need to, you need to take a look at the things that perhaps they have been doing that now they don't need to do anymore because you've got a different model. There may be some things that they're still holding on to that they're doing based on the old model, but making sure they have the latitude to have those conversations or find a way to partner with faculty. So part of the conversation happens with advisors and part happens with faculty. But I agree that's, as I was looking at some of the recommendations from other states and from Michigan as well, I do think that that's going to be a challenge, right? If we want to have meaningful, but that's always, it's not just for guided self-placement. I would say whenever, as we recommend holistic advising redesign, just in general across campuses, we recommend that advisors are given the space to have those meaningful conversations with students because they are very often the first person that the student sees on campus to take the time to talk to them about their plans and what they're doing. Jillian, I'm looking at your time to engage with each student in a large cohort is a challenge, especially when the student is primed to believe they're going to meet one time and come away registered for classes. That is true. Is there anything, so could you unmute and just talk a little bit more about that, if you don't mind? You don't have to.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about it. We've just implemented the companion course to intermediate algebra or liberal arts math for this semester. And students coming in the summer to register for fall, many, and this is not new to anyone who works at a community college, but we have students who are coming in on their lunch hour. Mm-hmm. We have students who are coming at a distance and want to, quote unquote, get everything done in one day. Yeah. Are not unlike a lot of community colleges. We will promote from time to time rapid enrollment days, mm-hmm. which again delivers the message that all of this can happen very quickly and in a short period of time. And I think all of those are barriers to the student actually slowing down to consider the questions we're offering, providing to them. The guided part of it, they're kind of trying to trip over it and just get to an answer so they can leave with everything done.
I think that's a great point. And I don't have a solution to that. Is there anybody that works in this model right now that has something that they'd like to add about that? Any way that they are freeing up time so those conversations can happen?
I would say that we've found we possibly are finding a partial answer in that we have a Title III grant where we have 2 advisors working through our Title III grant who have smaller groups. They only have groups of 100 students to mentor, which is much more manageable than what the rest of our mentors across the college do. So they certainly have more time to have these conversations with the students. I think folks who have TRIO programs probably have similar things happening in TRIO programs where you have dedicated TRIO advisors. We have TRIO advisors too, but it is the other students who don't fall into one of those programs who, you know, it's exactly as Jelena, I'm sorry if I mispronounced it, said, you know, get them through because that's what they want and that's what they need. And they simply get registered. Now we do have guided self-placement in English. So the vast majority of our students just place into the freshman English class, and most of them don't even take the new co-requisite class that we've created. We've got very, very low enrollments in the co-requisite class, but that's probably largely because those discussions aren't occurring to the degree that they need to be occurring.
Great. Thank you, Steve. That's really helpful. That's really helpful. And I do think it's going to be and this doesn't surprise me, right? A continuous tension between, do we have the time to have these meaningful conversations? And, you know, the push, because students are very much used to this from our colleges, to have everything done in a day. And you know, that's not always, I mean, it may be good service, right? But is it good for the student, right? And for the decisions that they're going to be making that day. So I think there will continue to be tension there. So thank you for jumping in and sharing that. And thank you for the question. That was a great question. And if anything else, any other questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. So this is some of the information that came out of California. These recommendations actually came out of a paper from Strong Start. That was, the study was done in collaboration with Phase 2 Advisory, which is Melinda Karp's office, that she used to work for Community College Research Center. So I keep an eye on her research pretty closely. And so the recommendations here also align well with the principles that I think you are using in Michigan. And I like these recommendations because you can implement that. They're high level, first of all, and I think they're pretty easy to understand. And you can implement these again in a way that makes sense for your college. But the recommendations from that study, from the Strong Start study, include trusting the students, right? So as you have this conversation with them, trusting them, and as they tell you their experiences and, you know, the knowledge that they have, trust them, right? Train your advisors to have these conversations, right? These are different kinds of conversations that we're asking. And so how can we make sure that we prepare advisors for these conversations? Connecting students with placement, connecting placement with support. So making sure that students have the support that they need. And that comes with that. So when we talk about support, we're talking about not only our co-requisite support, which is super important with the guided self-placement model, but then also making sure that they have support for the sometimes we call them non-academic type of needs, basic needs, to make sure that, because taking care of those types of needs that students have can also help them to be successful, right? So how do we make sure that we're connecting students with support as we place them? So not just or not only the co-requisite support, but also any type of student support, basic needs support. And then as we talked about earlier, communicating for clarity. I think that is so important because it will help students make choices if they can understand what we're talking about. And very often students don't understand what we are talking about because we use jargony language or things that don't make sense to them. So I'm curious, as you think about planning for this change, you know, what do you need to do at your college to help realize these recommendations, right? So what do you need to do to create systems, to redesign processes where your students and your advisors are set up for success, right? So what do your advisors need so they can do this? Who needs to be trained? What type of training do they need to have? What attitudes or biases do we need to address to make this successful? How do we connect students to supports? And so there's a quote that came out of that paper that I thought was really, it resonated with me. And I do think, again, to recognize the tension that we just talked about, but the quote says that placement systems that provide high guidance are best poised to create equitable outcomes when advisors have been trained to identify the biases they hold and to prevent these biases from overshadowing the guidance that they provide to students, right? And so that is, students not seeking guidance and not having our advisors ready to give this type of guidance is a potential risk or a danger in this model. And so, and I will share this link in the chat after I'm done sharing my screen, because I can't pull it while I'm sharing my screen. But if you have not seen it, I will drop that in the chat. And so, some of the early outcomes, so I've been, scouring for data, and California actually has some data. They've been at this for a while, like I said, so they have some data, but it's difficult to find disaggregated data widely reported in the literature for community colleges. But some of the early data indicates that more students are placing into gateway courses, right? So they are starting right away earning college credit. Fewer students are withdrawing. More students are successful in gateway courses, but again, this typically is not disaggregated data. So that is something that needs to be further explored, right? And as you assess and iterate your models, making sure that you are looking at your different groups of students that come to your college to make sure that the model as you have it is meaningful and supportive to students at your institution. Some of the early equity data suggests that certain students will underplace themselves, even if they meet the criteria for the gateway course. Many times they will underplace themselves, and this includes females, Black and Latinx students. And so this is why, again, we speak to the importance of advising conversations to make sure that our advisors are having these conversations with students, talking in a very asset-based way about, the students' experiences and what we see as their strengths and what they see as their strengths and how that relates to their placement at the institution. And so, as we think about these equity considerations, and we are actually going to have a session, our next session is actually going to be focused a little bit more on these equity conversations as we engage students in these conversations for guided self-placement. But some of the large categories of equity considerations that we need to consider is implicit bias in policies that we have and in practices that we have at our institutions, right? And we may not have developed or built or drafted these policies. We may have been hired into processes, but it's really important that we take a look with a critical eye to policies and practices to make sure that we are not perpetuating inequities in how we work. The other thing is, this was mentioned in a few of the articles that I read, is that there's a power dynamic between faculty and student, or advisor and student. And so taking into consideration how that can influence a student's choice is important. It gives the person who's having that conversation a really important role with the student, and making sure that we have those conversations in equitable ways is important. And then finally, students internalize what society says about their abilities, and this influences their beliefs and their confidence in their abilities. So, these sociocultural biases, or what our students internalize from the outside, is important to take into consideration and be aware of as we support our students in making choices around placement in math and English. So this brings us back to the importance of the advising role. It's a critical part of this process. You know, we recognize that building relationships with your students is important, not just for guided self-placement, but also for any type of advising that you're going to give your students, right? We want students to come to us with needs. We want to make sure that we have a trusting relationship with them. So, you know, and this can be with advisors, it can be with faculty, it should be with whoever is most comfortable or whoever is most comfortable for the student to have that relationship. Advisors should be a source of support and information, both support for the guided self-placement, the requirements for courses, the requirements for the curriculum and the curriculum pathways, but then also a source of information for other types of supports that might help the student with basic needs and things like childcare, mental health, food or housing insecurity that can help keep a student enrolled as they start their journey with us. Again, we just mentioned understanding how the curriculum fits into their pathways and leads students to success. And then that collaborative role, and somebody mentioned that earlier in the chat, and I was so happy to hear that, right? So this is collective work between faculty and advisors. It's important as things change on either side, right, to make sure that that our partners and stakeholders across campus are aware of any changes that we've made, either in placement and decisions about placement, in any other types of supports that we offer on the student affairs side, making sure that everybody is aware of any changes. And that keeps from miscommunicating to students and making sure that they have all the information that they need. So is there any questions? I don't see anything. I haven't seen the chat light up. I've either mesmerized you or you're all taking a nap. Hopefully it's not the latter. But I did want to, if there isn't anything that you want to share right now, I did want to move on to a couple of examples from the field, and then also talk a little bit to a college that we have with us today about their guided self-placement model. So just a few examples from the field. These came out of an article Informed Self-Placement Today. And so it talks about Western Nevada. So it talks about Western Nevada, and it also talks about St. Petersburg College. And both of those colleges are in states where there were state mandated changes to how colleges could offer developmental education on campus. California is very similar, right? These are why we see some of these early examples coming out of these states, is because those are state mandated type changes. So Western Nevada, you know, they work with an online type survey to get students, that's their initial assessment. Students also, besides solving for problems in this sort of diagnostic quiz, they report on their reading and writing skills, their interest levels with regard to English and math, right? All of these things are things that never came out of the original, our sort of traditional placement models. And when they talk with students, the students' level of confidence is actually far more important to them than their ability to solve the problem. Most likely, at least in part, for the reason that we talked about earlier, right? When I showed you the equation of a line example from the quiz that I attempted to take online. You know, the ability to solve a problem in that moment, especially if the student hasn't prepared for the diagnostic quiz, you know, their level of confidence, again, is more important than their capacity to solve at that moment. And then they are a co-requisite support model as well. So they explain the importance of co-requisite and then give students that option. So that is an example. I'm just trying to, if there's someplace else that you'd like to look, Western Nevada is an option. And we could make connections to you if you wanted to talk to somebody there. St. Petersburg College is another. They have been working on holistic support of students for a very long time. Their guided self-placement work, they work with their advisors to make sure that they are properly trained. They use a case management approach to build relationships with students and sort of help guide these conversations. They use high school transcript, and they also use that to offer some different options for students. I think what stood out about the St. Petersburg College example as I was looking through is that they require advising before a student can pick and register for courses, right? So, I go back to the conversation that we had earlier. So showing up on campus and the week before classes start, this could make this difficult. We don't want to create barriers for students, but I think what St. Petersburg has said in this or relayed in this requirement is that the advising conversation is so important that they are willing to stop students for it before they proceed to registering for courses. And so, as long as you have the capacity to have these conversations and you have enough advisors, right, as Steve mentioned earlier, you have enough advisors to make this happen, then it isn't necessarily a barrier to make sure that students have that contact and that connection. And then the last sort of example from the field that I will share is Ozark Technical College. They have been working for many years also on guided self-placement. They use the ACT and the high school GPA as part of the criteria that they use. They have an online assessment. That's actually the one that I took, that for students, it's easily accessible. It shows sample problems, asks about confidence. It does require students as well to have a conversation before placement. And the thing about Ozark Tech is that if the fit is not correct for the student, then they can move to another course in the same semester early in that semester. Excuse me 1 second. That's my sign that it's time to stop talking. So I think with OTC though, students can move early in the semester if they feel they've been misplaced or they have selected poorly. But what they're finding is students aren't really taking that choice. They are staying where they are and they feel like they've been well placed. So I did want to share, if you wanted to connect with anybody from those colleges, we can certainly make that happen. Maybe you already are familiar with those models, but it may give you somebody else to talk to as you think about how you proceed with and implement your guided self-placement model. Okay, so I am going to unshare my screen in just a second, but we do have Eric Chamberlain and Steve Amadon, I hope I said your name right, from Mid-Michigan. They're going to talk to us a little bit about their model because I wanted to pull in some expertise from Michigan so you can hear what's going on right here in your own backyard, even though I know Michigan's a big state. So let me stop sharing that. Let me unshare that and pull up my questions. So Steve and Eric, welcome and thank you for taking the time to talk to us a little bit about your model. So can we start out by asking you to explain how your model works on your campus? I understand that it's primarily for English, but if you could talk a little bit about what that looks like at Mid-Michigan.
You want to talk about it, the English model, Eric, or?
You can go ahead, Steve.
All right. We have a self-place. When I came to Mid about 4.5 years ago, the college was in the process of getting rid of the AccuPlacer test, which disappeared in my first 6 months here. And the English faculty had decided to move down the road to a guided self-placement system. And the math faculty had moved down the road to using multiple measures. And that's where they were when I got here. The English self-placement system basically uses what we call a JOT form, which is a series of questions that a student would answer that to a large degree is asking them questions in terms of their confidence level, their knowledge of some basic things like how do you how do you construct certain types of written artifacts, a little bit of their experience working with certain genres of writing, those kinds of questions to get a very, very basic feel for where the students stand. Now, when I arrived here, MID had 3 English classes. English 104, which, if I'm correct in saying that, was more of a reading-based class, Eric, was that correct? Yeah, that was more of a reading-based class than English 110, and then English 111. English 104 was discontinued the semester I arrived. At the time I arrived, we were running probably upwards of 20 sections of English 110. And probably half our students took English 110 before they took English 111. We implemented the guided self-placement system. It is done by our mentors, our advisors. They have the students go through and complete the JOT form. But what we've seen over the past 4 to 5 years is we are down from 20-some sections of that English 110 down to less than 4 a
We
semester.
have 4, yeah.
Yeah, about 4 a semester.
And
We
one
do
of them
have
is in the
one
high school.
partner high school that in their dual credit program want their students to take the English 110 and then take the English 111 because they feel that their high school students are not prepared for the English 111 class. But yeah, we've seen a great decrease. Now, the good news is that during that period, we've looked at this very closely with institutional research. The failure rate in English 111, the gateway course, has not seen an increase, even though the number of students in remedial English has just went down to almost 0. And when you consider that there are a few certificate programs and such that English 110 is the only English course they have to take for those programs. They're not required to take an MTA transferable type English course. It's even greater than you would realize. That being said, I would not make the outrageous claim that we have proven that remediation is unnecessary, because in that 5 years, a lot of other things have happened. Like many colleges, we had significant enrollment declines. Because of that, a much larger percentage of our English 111 classes are taught by full-time faculty. And when I first got here, we would often be scrambling to find faculty to teach those courses. So we sometimes had varying experience, maybe not always the best faculty. Now, all of our English 111 classes, I can say, are taught by either full-time faculty or very experienced adjunct faculty. So that probably is another reason we haven't seen a decline, to be perfectly honest. I will say that when Michigan Reconnect came along, I was a little annoyed because we already had self-placement where students did not have to take a remedial class. And yet, because of the law, we were pretty much pushed into developing a co-rec course. So we do have a co-rec course. The co-rec course, probably the largest section has 5 students. I just are not getting any students choosing to enroll in the co-rec course. Now, I think part of that is I don't think our placement model really has been, our self-placement has really been sufficiently updated to suggest or move students into those co-rec courses. But the other side of it is I don't think our mentors or advisors find that our students want to take a co-rec course. I mean, to be perfectly honest, we are a state right now, we are at a point right now where students want to get through their program as fast as possible, even when as fast as possible is not the right model. You know, and as Dean of Arts and Sciences, I see this in the sciences all the time. We have an A&P class that is a 6-credit, 8 contact hour combined class. And for a student to succeed in it, they need to put in, particularly in the online version, 20 to 24 hours of work outside their class. So the failure rate in the class is enormous, where the students would be far better served if they took A&P 1 followed by A&P 2 and got more attention. But students are in a hurry. They want to get there as quickly as possible. They want to get through their nursing prereqs as completely as possible. And even though our mentors try to encourage our students to choose a path that is most successful, the students resist the mentors. They will often do what they want to do when they have that choice. And you know, I would make the similar argument that, you know, we're at a point right now at where we're about, even post-COVID, we're about 50% fully online, where there are a number of students who would probably do much better in a richer face-to-face environment, and yet who are choosing online because of the convenience, because of the jobs that they can get, and because of the childcare shortages that they're facing. So there are all kinds of factors affecting the reason students are making the choices there. And I know we've got some advisors in this group who could probably go into gory detail on this subject about how students will often resist the best advice. In terms of math, the math faculty have been very resistant to fully embracing self-placement. They do, in terms of Michigan Reconnect, we have a multiple measures model that is based upon high school grades and SAT scores, and previous college course scores if they've had them. And in order to meet the requirements of Michigan Reconnect, they've embraced the model where we put our Math 104 in an 8-week, first 8 weeks, and then they can move into either calculus or an algebra or a math for liberal arts type course in the second 8 weeks. They are very, very resistant to the recommendations. They're they're not convinced by the arguments about guided self-placement, and they would like, I think, would like to see more data. I mean, there's certainly data out of California that shows that students who can bypass the remedial program are more likely, a larger percentage end up graduating. But the question I'm not sure of, if students are placed into gateway courses, do the failure rates in those gateway courses increase? And I have not seen that data. So, you know, students fail their first courses in math and English very often, whether it's a gateway course or a remedial course. There is a lot of truth that in their first semester, that's when students are most likely to crash and burn. As a student who crashed and burned in my first semester at Michigan State, I can verify that as well. Yeah, I think it's complicated, but I am glad we went to self-placement, because I do like, you know, I am a great believer in the idea of an open access institution. And to me, the idea of open access, but throwing a ton of prerequisite students are just philosophically incompatible with each other, but that's just me.
Great. Thank you for that. So I'm curious, as we think about the folks on campus that are involved with supporting students through this model, specifically really the role of advisors and faculty. Can you talk a little bit about their roles in this guided self-placement model and the kinds of training that they get maybe to prepare them for that role? Can you guys hear me okay?
I do not have much knowledge about the training that folks received when this was first implemented.
So it's primarily mentors that, that
Mentors
engage-
are the ones that do the work with the students to do the placement. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so what's the role of faculty? I'm curious.
I don't have a role in it. So if I did, in the past, for many years, we've met with advisors. I would meet with them occasionally throughout the year because of turnover. And I would just give information about our courses, some things we did with our courses. We've done other things where there were sample readings that advisors or mentors could give to students, and students could kind of reflect on where they were with things and make a more informed choice. But since we implemented this one, I can't say that I've had a lot of interaction with it. So what I see is students coming in, and I don't have a sense of, like we used to talk all the time, are people being placed in the right place? And now they're in the right place because they picked it. And do they struggle sometimes? Of course. But I don't see, it would be nice, I think, if our institution did more in terms of bringing faculty into that loop. And we've had some questions about it, or we've had some discussions about faculty mentors and things like that. So if there's a place where we can improve on this, that's one of them.
Just, I mean, quick question. Follow up, what kinds of information would be helpful for you to have as a faculty member? What would you like to know? Or what would you like to share with the mentors as they are placing?
I would like to give them more information about our courses. I would like students to know what they're walking into and what they're choosing.
Got it. Great.
And that can happen. I'm not saying it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I don't know to what degree it happens.
Got it. Very helpful. So I'm curious at any of the other institutions that are here participating with us. Are there any of you that are working? Do you have advisors or mentors working with faculty on your placement model?
You know, it looked like about 30% of people said that their college has an active GSP process on the call. So hopefully, would love to hear from some of you that are actually using the process.
Hi, Lori. This is Pam at Kirtland.
Hi, Pam.
We use a similar form, not a JOT form, but a form that is sent to students for both math and English. And I think are you asking mostly about math right now?
Math or English. I know that math is, at least across most of what I've read, is a little slower to be developed.
Okay, so we do the same. We have 2 surveys that we send. If a student doesn't have placement information based on GPA, high school GPA and or SAT, ACT. For students who have been out of school 10 years or more, we send this math survey to them, to all of them. And the math is a series of questions. I think it's 8 questions. I'd have to look. 8 questions, and it asks them their familiarity of being able to solve the question. They don't solve it. They kind of like what you had talked about. You know, I think I could possibly get there maybe with a quick review. And then that was developed by math faculty, but in all honesty, we haven't had a lot of conversations from an advisor standpoint where data was presented about where students placed and where they finished in that course. And we haven't had much of an update since we just changed that for fall semester. So very interesting conversations though today.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Pam. I'm curious. I mean, do you ask them to the slope of a line? Because that seems to be stumping for many people struggled with the slope of the line. But you know, thank you to Eric and Steve for sharing and being honest about, you know, what the implementation looks like at your institution. This work is, I guess, I would say hard and messy, right? And we're really trying to do right by the students to make sure that they have some agency in the process, but making sure they have enough guidance and support so they are well placed so they can be successful. Because, you know, ultimately we want them to finish in a timely fashion and not be stuck in the, you know, the sort of, you know, the traditional death spiral of placement, you know, the traditional placement that we've had. You know, I think at my institution, we had, I mean, you could take up to 2 years of developmental math before you could hit a college level math course, right? So, I mean, that's just it, you know, as we think about what's good for students, that doesn't seem in their best interest. So I'm curious we're going to go to a breakout in just a minute, but I'm curious if there's anybody else that's implementing that would like to share a little bit about their model. I do think there's opportunity for collaboration, just as Pam mentioned, taking data and sharing it across faculty and advisors as you think about, you know, how students are doing on the assessment, the conversations that are happening, the placement that occurs, and then how they do there. It feels like there's lots of opportunities to gather some data there to evaluate and assess the model. Is there anybody else that'd like to jump in? I don't see any takers. I can usually wait a really long time, but I know that we are, I know we don't have a really long time together. So, okay, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back. Thank you, Eric, for sharing your JOT form. That was really helpful. Actually, I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm actually going to keep that as a resource that I have when colleges ask me. I try to collect resources for colleges as they think about how they can either start this process or if they get stuck. So we are going to
send feedback too if you have some.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to share, hopefully you can see this. So we are going to break you out into about what time is it? Maybe like 15 minutes and ask you, we're just going to randomly put you in some groups and ask you to, first of all, share with each other what's going on your campuses. I think that is really important as you continue to build a network across the state and find folks that you can reach out to for support if you need it or resources. And you know, then I would ask you to think about these 3 questions. So thinking about your unique context at your institution, what elements would you need to include for a successful guided self-placement model at your college, right? So Steve talked about the resistance of math faculty. And so how can Maybe if that's part of your context, what kinds of elements would you need to include in your model on your campus? And then thinking about what would be the expectations of the advisors or the mentors, whatever role deals or interfaces with students as they make this decision. So what would be the expectations of that role? And then what type of supports or resources or professional learning would you need to feel comfortable in that role? So I will go ahead and I'm going to do two things. I'm going to stop my share. I'm going to, hang on one second. I'm going to share these questions in the chat so you have them in your breakout rooms. See if I can get this to work. So you should be able to see those. Can everybody see those? Did they pop up in the chat for you? Excellent. And then I am going to put us in breakout rooms of, let's see, do I have access to breakout rooms? I do. So I will go ahead and create, let's see, there are roughly 7 breakout rooms. So you should see your breakout room open up and see it flash on your screen. If you don't see it, let me know. But go ahead and join your breakout room.
Hi there. I
Hey.
apologize. As this happened, I had someone come in with a urgent student concern. So I missed like the last probably 10 minutes of what happened.
No problem.
So
We
I
completely
apologize for that.
understand. So you should see in your chat some questions, and I'm just, if it's okay, I'm going to send you to a breakout room to have about a 15-minute discussion with your colleagues.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see if I can make that show up again. So if you look down at where it says
Yeah,
participants, do you see it? Okay.
Yeah.
Super.
Thank you.
Sure.
Doesn't want to send me out.
No?
No, not yet. I am reading the chat questions. Those are good questions.
Oh, thank you. Let's see if we can't send you to a different one. Let's see. Go back to my breakout rooms. So I'm going to send you to room 2.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. There we go.
All right.
That one didn't have that many people. Do you want to
Yeah.
pause your recording, Jenny, while we're,
Yes, I will do that. Good
That one.
idea.
that will give you less editing to do later. Okay. I think folks are still coming back.
Mhm.
I've got another few seconds. Here we go. Welcome back, everybody. Still waiting for a few more folks to come out of their breakout rooms. There we go. Can always tell when they close, the number just shoots right up.
Yep.
All right, so I'm going to leave my screen unshared. I'd love for us to hear from some of the groups about what you talked about. Even if you didn't talk about the questions, my feelings will not be hurt. I know that sometimes you get with colleagues and you start talking about other things. Dawn, thank you for sharing your email. Would anybody like to share what they were talking about in their room?
Don't all speak at once.
It's okay. Pam shared something in the
Is
chat.
that Bunker Hill?
Yeah, it looks like it's something from Bunker Hill. Yep.
Great.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
I mean,
sharing that, Pam.
I can go and kind of summarize a little bit from our group. There was conversation
Sure.
of concern about, students listening to the advice of the advisors and what that might look like, training needs and how to involve faculty in that. Is there a questionnaire? I think the example of the slope is perfect. Is this something or is it something that you can kind of refresh yourself on? And then I reiterated to our group as we are kind of talking through this here at KVCC, our advisors don't teach English and math. So training is going to be key
Yeah.
so that they feel confident in the advice that they're giving. And then support. What does support look like? Because, knowing from past work at other institutions that students that kind of bypass prerequisites, maybe even accidentally, may not be as successful. Why is that? And again, what do those supports or those wraparounds look like?
Great. Thank you, Angela. Super helpful.
I would add to what Angela said that we talked about thinking about training and supports that we will need is that at Kellogg Community College, we're in the early stages of implementing this. And I feel like we need to have a close collaboration between faculty or at least department chairs, but faculty also and the advising staff so that we all know what outcome we're trying to achieve. Like Angela said, we don't teach English, we don't teach math, so we depend on the faculty for that expertise and would need their help in creating a good outcome for everyone.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Thanks
Good
for sharing
point.
that. Yeah.
Good point.
We also talked about in our group as an advisor, it would be very helpful when we're starting this process, at least to have some kind of like rubric or flow chart for
Mhm.
us as advisors to kind of use as a guide. I feel like this process is very new to all of us, and that would just help give us some framework to work in, so that we know kind of like what our perimeters are if we kind of get stumped with a student. So we're supposed to be leading and guiding conversations, and yet we don't have a framework for that. It can be kind of overwhelming and not as productive if we were all using the same map to get us to where we were trying to go.
I think that's a great point.
Mhm.
And thank you for sharing that, Alexis, because I think that, while we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can for students, we also need to, I think there's an expectation that we need to do this in a relatively efficient manner, right? So to have some sort of tool or rubric, I think that's informed by faculty and advisors or mentors would be a very helpful tool. And then if you get stuck, who do you call, right? So who can you reach out to if you have a student sitting in front of you and there's a question that you can't answer, or is something, I took this class, is it equivalent to this? If you need some additional support, who do you then reach out to? So I think those are really great points.
I can just share from our room, and I'll share something that I talked about, which was sort of echoing some of the earlier conversation about that tension, that push and pull between creating an onboarding process that is efficient from an admissions recruitment standpoint and the long-term goals of success and retention. And I would love to be able to get to a point where I could use the kind of rubric we're talking about or flow chart. But to do that when you're trying to have 200 students come through an orientation in 3 or 4 hours is super tricky. So I think we need to invite our friends in enrollment, in admissions, to these kinds of conversations so they can hear about the why. Why are we doing this? And why is this important to our institution? And I think for that, we also need support from our leadership in making it a priority. That we can't just do business as usual and go back to how we've always done things. If we really want to make this shift, we have to make some meaningful change in all of our processes.
Thank you, Lindsay. Also great points. And I do love how you're sort of expanding the circle, right, of stakeholders that should be included, especially as your enrollment and admission staff may be out recruiting in high schools with large group of students. Like, what do they need to know as they talk about placement with large groups of students, especially when you have the parents' captive audience there, right? You've got the parents there, right? So how can you start to have these conversations so they are meaningful and the parents can understand too? And again, I go back to that communication piece, right? How do we what is our language around this so it's easy for students to understand, their parents to understand, our colleagues to understand, right? So how do we make sure that we are speaking in language that makes sense and isn't jargony, or, I call it educationese, right? So you have to have an education degree to understand it. And I also agree that you need to have, it needs to be supported by leadership, not just, not just the rah, yeah, let's do this kind of support. I support you, but I call that sort of the blessing of the fleet, go and do. But I also think it's the resources. They have to be there to either, support the model that you've come up with, to create the resources that you need, to create opportunities for networking, either within your institution or across institutions. So I think you bring up some really good points. And I'm sorry, I heard somebody else unmute, and I want to give you the chance to jump in. We probably have time for one or two more folks. Are there things that are going well? Things that you need? Stephanie, go ahead. I see you unmuted. Oh, no, change them. No problem, Stephanie. Julie asked, I wonder how many other institutions like Kellogg have a reading, sorry, I lost it, a reading placement requirement.
There are still a few institutions, but not as many as there used to be, who have reading placement and dedicated reading classes.
I guess for those of you, let me ask one more question since I still have a couple more minutes, and I feel like this might help us feed into some of the resource question. What are you most nervous about as you implement this type of model at your institution? What worries you?
I'm worried about consistency, internal consistency. So the example I brought up in our room was that right now we're using placement scores, which everyone would be looking at the same placement scores if they were meeting with the same student. Now we have 7 advising staff here. How much consistency are we going to have if one student visited all 7 of us? Would we get a consistent outcome? And going back to what Alexis was saying about having a rubric or a flow chart or something that's going to help bring consistency, internal consistency to that process.
Thanks, Julie. Appreciate that. Nobody has any other worries about implementing a guidance? You guys are all confident and good to go.
I'll go. I think my biggest concern, because I advise on a lot of selective admissions programs, is that people are going to put themselves in the course that's going to speed up their timeline. And when we count attempts for some classes, that is going to potentially shoot them in the foot and have long-term consequence. I think paired, I really like the discussion or the point that was brought up that one of the colleges will let you transition out of a course. So if you're in a math course and you're way out of your head, if it's early in the semester, they'll let you switch. We are not like that at all at KCC. You only have like until midnight the day class starts to get into that class, and it's kind of a cumbersome process to do a late add, and it's at instructor's discretion and sometimes it's not approved. So I don't know, I guess that would be my concern is for my students, right? That they're not gonna be making the best decisions, even with our guidance, because they see that timeline.
It's a great point. Go ahead, Karen. Thank you, Kayla.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that a little bit. So I'm in my second week of this job. So I'm brand new as the registrar at Gogebic, but I'm
Welcome.
coming from thank you. I'm coming from a small liberal arts college where we had a really robust co-requisite program. And I think one of the reasons I'm really excited about this position and one of the reasons I wanted to go into this kind of work is what are the policies in the institutions that need to be adjusted to make the programs be successful. And so like Caleb's example is a great one. If we have policies that don't allow students to enter into a course, what does that mean? What is the repeat policy? What is, those sorts of things, like what, and so maybe some resources around best practices related to policy would be interesting.
Thanks, Karen. That's a really great point. I think sometimes we change our processes or practices without taking a look at our policies, right? And see if they still support us and enable us to do the job that we want to do. So I think that's a really good point. All right. Best practices and policy. I'm just making some notes here. Anything else? Thank you so much for your engagement and your willingness to go into breakout rooms and talk to each other. I really do appreciate that. I also wanted to take a minute to thank Stephen and Eric from Mid-Michigan for sharing some of the information about their model and their resource with us. I'm going to turn it back over to Jenny, but thank you again for joining today. I will put my email in the chat. If you have any questions or want some resources, I will work hard to find them for you. So I'll turn it back over to you, Jenny.
Thank you. Thanks, Lori. And I want to thank Lori for the work that she did to prepare this. And we're excited to embark on this series of activities that will be in support of guided self-placement. We will have a second part to this webinar, to this workshop that will happen in March, but we also have an upcoming roundtable for to talk about guided self-placement. So it'll be there won't be presenting, there will be just an opportunity to kind of share what's going on at your colleges, share lessons, share, we'll have some light facilitation, and that's going to be on December 7th. All of these, let's see, I'm going to put a pin in that right now, and I'm going to drop in the chat a link to a very short survey that will help us to plan our upcoming activities. And then I'm going to put in our mcca.org/events, which you should go to find out the dates of all and register for upcoming activities. But I will tell you that the first roundtable is going to happen. The first guided self-placement roundtable that is going to be on Wednesday, December 7th. So please go out to that events page and check out what the dates are, register for some of these events. You'll find it on a couple of different places. One more, I'm going to share one more link before I let you go. Hang on. Where is that one? Yes. If you want to know more about our activities supporting the Michigan Developmental Education and Placement Recommendations, please visit this page on our website. And you'll find out more about, and that's where we're recording all of these. We're posting all of the support materials that we're developing at this point. So again, check out that survey form and help us to plan the next activity. And we will look forward to seeing you again on December 7th.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.